right, welcome back everyone. Coming up next we have Somindu talking through cognitive warfare when defenders stop updating their mental model. I think Somindu, you might be our youngest presenter at OzCert so far. So congratulations, we're very excited to have you.
Thank you.
And I hear you're also an expert lockpicker as well.
Yeah, some would say, yeah.
Yep, okay. So we've pointed security out to you already, so we know to look out for you. But yeah, can I please get a massive round of applause for Somindu? Thank you.
So before I start, I just want to have a quick show of hands, right? Who here has kids? All right. So from those hands, how many of your kids are still using social media after the under 16s ban? All right, yeah. Problems, huh? So that ban was supposed to solve a clear problem, right? Instead of solving said problem, it locked out legitimate users, it falsely flagged a lot of adults, and it frustrated a lot of parents. And yet the best part was, the teenagers were sharing their bypass methods on the exact same platforms that they were supposed to be blocked out of. So the interesting part isn't that the system failed. We knew that the system would fail. The interesting part is how it failed. See, the ban worked exactly against who it was built for. The problem is the designers built it for the average teenager. And the bypasses weren't exactly average. See, the bypasses, the teenagers that actually bypassed the ban, were sort of self-selected for traits of curiosity, persistence, experimentation, and most importantly, lateral knowledge sharing. See, you see this all the time, right? Where a control will get deployed, and then it works against the people it was built for. But then someone just outside of that model operates on your model, and then suddenly the control becomes invalid. It becomes irrelevant. Not necessarily because the technology was bad, but because the assumptions underneath the technology, the assumptions that was the foundation to the but what they didn't update was their mental model of the adversary. That's what I wanted to talk about by cognitive warfare here. Cognitive warfare isn't just attacking infrastructure, software, and credentials blindly, right? It's the exploitation of how defenders can build models of threat in the first place, exploiting those internal models. So attackers don't always win by breaking the system itself. Sometimes they win by operating in the spaces the defender's model never predicted. And by the time that the model even updates, the damage is already done. So this raises somewhat of a deeper question, right? How did attackers exploit defenders' assumptions? And where did those assumptions come from in the first place? Because defenders obviously don't all perceive threats in the same way, right? Even with identical tooling, identical telemetry, or identical training, people will always orient differently towards uncertainty and threat. So some will instinctively search for stability, unknown patterns. Some will search for anomalies and ambiguity. And in cybersecurity, that difference becomes really engraved in your operations, which then brings us to the roots of psychology in blue and red teaming. See, blue and red teaming aren't psychologically neutral at all. How you approach offensive versus defensive security or work is partially shaped far before you ever touch a terminal. Psychology has known for decades that people differ in cognitive styles. People think differently. Some people like to explore the unknowns. Some like to stay in the systems that are already known. And constantly, you can see this play out in security teams. See, one analyst might go and say, this is probably random noise, right? Same traffic. Another analyst might look at the exact same data and ask, what if somebody wanted this to look like random traffic? So it's the same logs. It's the exact same training, the same tooling, but it's a completely different orientation of how you take uncertainty. Personality research broadly maps some of these differences through traits like openness to experience and conscientiousness, where higher openness tends to correlate with more curiosity, cognitive flexibility, novelty seeking, and a much higher tolerance for ambiguity, whilst higher conscientiousness and experience tends to correlate with order, structure, planning, enforcement, and consistency. And to be clear, this is not a one-to-one mapping of personality and security role. I'm not saying that every single red teamer has high openness and every single blue teamer and defender has really high conscientious. What I am saying though is that these traits bias attention differently. They influence what people will notice, what people will dismiss, and how much uncertainty they will tolerate. And also, how quickly they revise their assumptions. Revision of assumptions is going to be a big topic of recursion here. See, high openness cognition, as we said before, is often more willing to explore unconventional attack surfaces and question baseline assumptions, whilst high conscientious cognition is more effective at maintaining integrity and reducing variance. Both are very valuable. Neither are irrational to think of. But in an environment of adversaries, strengths can become trade-offs, right? The same mindset that allows someone to maintain stability really well will also make them slower at reinterpreting anomalies that violate expected or established expectations. And the same mindset that makes someone excellent at finding novel attack paths can make them slower and overfit patterns that aren't there in the first place, right? There's something called Gray's Behavioural Inhibition System, or BIS for short. It describes another layer and adds depth to this. It's where individual variation changes threat sensitivity in people. Some people are more naturally vigilant towards potential danger, but others need stronger signals before registering a threat as a threat. So two analysts, let's go back to the two analysts, identical tooling, identical training, can look at the exact same environment and orient it to risk completely differently. One will see the novelty and the ambiguity of things, whilst the others will see established baselines and known patterns, and they'll try to continue operations from one to another. And neither person here is irrational. But really, when you are an attacker, you only need one perspective to fail. Which means the question in cyber isn't which cognitive profile is correct. The question sort of shifts to which profile is the most adaptive against the compared to the adversary at this current moment. See, red and blue teaming don't just reflect their technical skill sets, right? Red and blue teaming don't reflect a deeper psychological orientation towards uncertainty, threat, structure, and revision. And those orientations will always shape what you see, what you ignore, and how fast you update, how fast you revise when reality inevitably changes. Now see, those operations don't just influence what you see in the moment though. They also influence how people update their beliefs over time. See, once a signal is interpreted through a particular lens, that interpretation then begins to shape what counts as credible evidence as you go forward. And this is where the cognitive differences in people moves from perception into beliefs updating themselves, which leads then directly into more subtle failure mode in defensive systems, where belief updating fails and cognitive systems are suddenly super stubborn. See, the cognitive profile that makes you really effective, right, can also make you exploitable. A researcher named Kunda, back in the day, published foundational work on something we now call motivated reasoning. The core idea is really simple. Human reasoning isn't neutral. We don't process evidence mechanically. We have directional goals, and we want certain conditions to be true. However, that is different from ordinary confirmation bias, right? Confirmation bias is you favoring evidence that supports claims that you already believe. Motivated reasoning goes a tad bit deeper, right? Motivated reasoning states that the conclusion you want changes how you evaluate evidence in the first place. Take an analyst, right? An analyst that believes an internal employee is not likely to be the cause for a breach, right? This analyst will now hold evidence that an insider actor to a much higher level of a higher standard of proof. They'll need more proof to think that an insider, an internal employee, is the cause for a breach. And this goes vice versa. If someone thinks that an external actor is highly unlikely, they'll obviously favor the evidence that an internal employee caused the breach. It's the same evidence, but the difference is the level of scrutiny that each person applies. See, because one explanation just feels more psychologically acceptable to a brain than the other. And this happens no matter who you are. Tabler and Loge demonstrated this empirically. People apply intense scrutiny to evidence that contradicts their beliefs while accepting supportive evidence with comparatively little resistance. And this is not irrationality, it is pure efficiency. Your brain cannot reevaluate every single belief you have every time new information appears. That would be computationally and mentally impossible. So instead, your brain uses priors, it uses heuristics, expectations, rules of thumb. And most of the time, that works perfectly fine. But in cyber adversarial environments, you're not facing against most of the times. Those those rules of thumb become vulnerabilities because attackers only need to exist outside of the assumptions your model treats as reasonable. And when you have many shortcuts, heuristics, rules of thumb, expectations inside of your model, the amount of assumptions you have increases drastically. And then you get connected into something even deeper, something called Friston's free energy principle. Friston's free energy principle frames the brain as a prediction engine of sorts, right? Where you maintain an internal model of the world. Then, with that internal model of the world, you make predictions. And then you compare incoming information against those predictions. And then you update, primarily when the prediction errors against the information that's incoming become large enough and trustworthy enough to matter. And then you can extend this further to perception, learning, attention, and action, all things that you undergo during your daily life. All become processes of minimizing the gap between what you expect and what you observe. And in operations, this has huge implications for cyber defense, because the more confidence you have in a model, the more contradictory evidence it'll take before you revise your model. Strong beliefs that you have before and have inherited will resist updating, not because a defender is lazy or irrational, but because stable models are efficient to your brain under normal conditions. The big problem is that adversarial environments are not normal conditions. In a fast-moving threat environment, the delay between anomaly and belief revision becomes the attack surface the attacker can target. And that's how models calcify. The heuristics, the rules of thumbs that help you triage effort alerts 5 years ago or so become filters that suppress novel patterns because they're no longer fitting of your expectations. So think about how many incidents get dismissed as something like user errors, misconfigs, noisy telemetry, or even just probably nothing. Not because the defenders are incompetent or irrational, but because the signal failed to exceed the prediction threshold that was required to trigger revision. The attacker doesn't necessarily need to exploit the software vulnerability first. They need to exploit the defender's confidence in an existing interpretation of reality. They operate in the space that the defender's model doesn't predict. And if the anomaly never feels significant enough to challenge the prior, the system will keep normalizing the attack until the damage becomes undeniable. And that's the reality of many operations in the modern day. Defenders are often late to emerging threats, not because they lack intelligence, but because the models inside of their brain are optimized for coherence, even if said coherence doesn't exist. And coherence, especially the one that doesn't exist, under adversarial pressure, becomes an attack surface. And that preference for coherence doesn't just shape how we interpret signals, it also shapes how we categorize actors generating signals. Because one of the most powerful ways our mind maintains coherence or reasonability is by simplifying who or what it is looking at. And that's where cognitive modeling starts to intersect with social perception, which brings us to social identity and adversary categorization. Who gets recognized as a threat is not a purely technical judgment. It is a social categorization decision. Social identity theory, developed by two people called Tashfel and Turner, showed that people naturally divide the world into yummy in-groups and yucky out-groups. And once those categories form, they begin shaping perception automatically. We stop evaluating people purely as the individuals they are. We start evaluating them through assumptions attached to the category that they belong to. Categories also carry these expectations with them. Expectations of competence, expectations of intent, of capability, sophistication, and most importantly, legitimacy. And those assumptions directly influence your threat modeling. See, children are probably the best example of this. The category child carries a whole boatload of connotations and expectations. They have limited technical knowledge, limited patience, limited strategic thinking, limited emotional regulation. And maybe on average, those assumptions are statistically reasonable. But the adversarial environments don't operate on the averages. They operate on the selective pressures that are on the people. See, the teenagers that bypassed Australians' age verification systems are not random samples of the population. As we discussed at the start, they are self-selected for curiosity, persistence, experimentation, and lateral knowledge sharing, allowing them to propagate their knowledge throughout the whole system of them. The design is optimized against the average user, but the adversaries were never average, and you see this pattern a lot in cyber. Think about labels like junior analyst, right? Non-technical user, business side employee, or outsider without institutional knowledge. All of these labels feel really descriptive, but in operation, they become predictive shortcuts. They shape the behavior we consider plausible from certain people, and adversaries can exploit that constantly. A junior researcher, maybe reports some suspicious behavior and gets completely ignored because they probably just misunderstood the task. Or maybe a phishing simulation succeeds because the defenders assume finance staff won't understand the infrastructure well enough to be dangerous, right? Or an attacker with no formal background at all bypasses a control specifically because they don't interact with the system the way that trained professionals expect them to. The threat isn't really invisible in the slightest. It's filtered out by the assumptions that you attach to each category. And this is why Australia's social media ban keeps struggling. It's not because their technology is weak at all. Their technology is really strong. But because the threat model remains anchored to the social category of child, instead of the observed adversarial behavior of us breaking it, the system keeps modeling children as the compliant average users. Meanwhile, the actual adversaries are adaptive, collaborative, and highly chronically online. Social identity shapes threat perception, and threat perception shapes defensive priorities. And if your categorization model is wrong, your defense strategy can become misaligned before a single technical control is ever deployed. And that is where categorization failure becomes dangerous to operations. Because once a system fixes a group in a simplified category, it doesn't just misinterpret them. It also limits what the system is capable of perceiving from them. And one of the ways this becomes especially visible in practice is through cognitive diversity and analysis and interpretation, which brings us to the role of neurodiversity and the absence of institutional assumptions. See, I can tell you, some of the fastest adaptations in cyber don't come from experience, correct? They come from what I believe to be the absence of institutional assumptions. The GCHQ, Britain's big spy center, somewhat like the Britain's FBI, publicly describes dyslexic thinking as mission critical in certain intelligence and security contexts. Why is that? Not because neurodivergent people are universally better analysts, not because of that, but because different cognitive profiles often processes information more differently than everyone else. They have different pattern recognition, they have different spatial reasoning, non-linear associations, big picture synthesis, and most importantly, unconventional problem navigation. The important point isn't superiority at all necessarily. It's about variance, having a varied perceptual coverage, right? Different cognitive profiles fail differently, and that will matter enormously in adversarial environments, because teams don't really just need redundancy. They need perceptual coverage. Institutional training is extremely good at producing reliability. Institutional training, however, is also very good at creating shared assumptions. What normal traffic looks like, what suspicious behaviors look like, what anomalies matter and which don't, and which patterns are just probably noise. Most of the times, these assumptions are useful. But if every single person on your team detects anomalies and processes anomalies through nearly identical priors, the same blind spot can propagate against the entire defensive system simultaneously. And that's where cognitive diversity becomes especially important. Someone who processes information differently may notice patterns others normalize away. Not because they're more intelligent, but because they never inherited the same institutional assumptions and priors in the first place. Think about how often novel attack paths are initially dismissed. They wouldn't realistically happen. Nobody would interact with the system in that way. Or that's just too unusual to matter. And then 6 months later, that exact case that you brushed off is now becoming the incident report you're wasting your life away writing. Every analyst on your team thinks the same way. You do gain reliability, yes, but you also narrow the range of things the organization is capable of perceiving. You get redundancy instead of coverage. And an adversary operating outside of your very shared assumptions can become effectively invisible to all of you at the same time. So in adversarial environments, the absence of institutional assumptions can become effectively a weakness, is not always a weakness. And it is sometimes exactly what allows somebody to see the thing everyone else filtered out. However, this problem also doesn't stay confined with humans. The same patterns of shared assumptions and compressed priors don't disappear when you introduce automation, which means the same cognitive structure that can create blind spots in analyst teams also can be reproduced and amplified in machine learning systems. And that's where the issue really becomes systemic, because the aligned blind spot exists. The same predictive architecture governing human cognition is now embedded in the AI systems we deploy across security operations. Machine learning systems are fundamentally prediction engines. They learn patterns from historical data. They build internal representations, and they generate expectations about what normal looks like. In that sense, the architecture isn't completely different from human cognition. Both humans and machine learning systems rely on priors, and both become vulnerable when those patterns that are created for reducing complexity stop matching the reality. Friston, his predictive processing framework, captures this well. Systems tend to minimize surprise by maintaining internal models and updating only when incoming signals exceed a threshold significant enough to trigger revision. And in machine learning, that threshold is encoded within the training data, optimization pressures, and feature weighting. And in that sense, it creates brittleness. And a good fellow called Ian Goodfellow demonstrated this clearly through adversarial examples. Tiny targeted perturbations or disruptions, often imperceptible to humans, can cause highly confident misclassifications in machine learning systems. The model isn't actually malfunctioning. It's functioning exactly as the statistical training data it was given. The vulnerability exists because the learned representation of reality is in fact incomplete. Attackers exploit the gap between the model and the environment it believes it understands. So let's bring that back into cyber, right? Imagine a SOC triage model, right? It's trained on years and years and years of historical analyst decisions. So if analysts have consistently classified some sort of internal lateral movement patterns as benign administrative behaviors, the AI inherits that prior. So when internal lateral movement patterns begin to arise and the AI sees that, it shows it as a low-risk confidence score. And when the human analyst comes to review what the AI found, and it finds low-risk confidence score, the analyst trusts the model because it reflects the historical organization judgment that the human analyst has made. And suddenly both systems, human and machine, converge on the exact same blind spot simultaneously. And that's the failure mode I call the aligned blind spot. It's when human prediction and machine prediction reinforce the same prior strongly enough that neither side meaningfully challenges the other anymore. There's no independent error correction. The alignment between human and machine becomes the vulnerability. There's no external perspective. There's no cognitive diversity between the operator and the system. So the important point isn't that AI is becoming like humans. The important point is that the danger of AI inheriting historical assumptions from humans, operational biases, so on, and then the AI executing them faster, more consistently, and at a much larger scale. We are taking institutional priors, embedding them into predictive systems, and then calling it defense in depth. And in the environments we operate in, I think that should concern us pretty deeply. So what you end up with is not just a technical alignment problem, it's a structural reinforcement loop. Human assumptions shape machine predictions, and machine predictions reinforce human assumptions, and it keeps going on and on and on until the feedback loop reduces the space for independent correction. So the failure mode is no longer isolated to either side, and the failure mode becomes embedded into the system as a whole. And that brings us to the more broad operational reality of it. Cognitive rigidity or stubbornness is not a failure of discipline. It's how predictive systems function, whether it's our brain or AI. Priors or inherited priors become entrenched because stable models are computationally efficient under stable conditions. And belief updating slows down because coherence, even if it doesn't exist, is much cheaper than constant revision of beliefs. Then social categorization exists because compressing complexity into categories makes the world more manageable and easy to navigate, right? And none of this is irrational, and most of the time it works. But adversarial environments are not most times. in an environment that changes faster than the model updates, it doesn't work out. And that is what's happening in most modern cyber defense systems. Most organizations do not optimize for belief revision because it will be implausible. They optimize for consistency, speed, defensibility, and continuity between operations. But operationally, it means something very important. If your organization rewards consistency more than they reward revision, it will systematically miss novel threats. So what do you do about it? Well, you can start by looking at your last few false negatives. Not just which control failed, right? Ask, what assumption caused the signal to look insignificant? And what prior did somebody have that caused them to dismiss the anomaly? And what interpretation of reality delayed the escalation? Then maybe find the person who noticed it early, someone who got overruled, someone who hesitated to escalate, or even someone who you think would have seen it coming if they had been in the room. Then ask them, what did you see that none of us did? Not to validate them at all, but so you can calibrate your own blind spot. Then maybe take one high confidence decision your organization holds. It doesn't have to be important, just high confidence. A threat assessment, an assumption, a threat boundary, a trust boundary, or risk rating, right? And hand it to someone whose cognitive profile is yours. Someone junior, someone from another domain, someone neurodivergent, someone who doesn't instinctively model the environment the same way you do. And then tell them, assume I am wrong. What would make me wrong? What am I failing to see? This does not need to scale to every single operational decision. It should target the dangerous ones, the ones everyone is confident about. Because high confidence judgments are exactly where the cognitive rigidity and stubbornness becomes the hardest to detect internally. And when someone gives you an interpretation that conflicts with your model, document it. Write it down somewhere, even if you disagree, even if you take no action, even if you don't hold the slightest care in the world to it. Just write it down. Because 6 months later, when the thing everyone dismissed becomes the thing the adversary exploited, you really want to know, was it actually invisible? Or did the organization collectively normalize it away? That is what the operational goal here should be. Not perfect prediction, because perfect prediction is impossible. If you had perfect prediction, cyber wouldn't exist. The goal is to prevent convergence of multiple people on the same blind spot. You have to operationalize dissent. You have to operationalize the existence of disagreement of different views as a part of your plan. You have to make it, you don't have to, you should be making it someone's responsibility to challenge assumptions before the adversary does. And you reward that process even when it's inconvenient or frustrating. Because attackers are not always outperforming defenders through superior intelligence, right? They often are just simply less constrained by the priors that made defenders successful in the first place. And that means that the final attack surface is not just technical infrastructure. The final attack surface is certainty itself. So in the end, your certainty is the attack surface. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was amazing.
Thank you.
We do not have any questions in through the app. Does anyone want to fire out a question? No? You've covered the bases absolutely perfectly. I need to give you a speaker gift as well. So thank you so much for coming along. for your first time presenting at OzCert. Love to have you here. Can I please get another massive round of applause? Thank you. So we're stopping for the lunch break now, and we come back at 1:25. So see you all back in here around then. Thank you.